Hi everyone, today we are going to talk about child development theories, and I'm going to try to go a little bit quickly, but I think this video is going to be a two-parter, so get ready for that. So we're going to start, we're going to kind of go through a list of the theorists that are available to you to write about for your theorist paper. We're going to cover some of the main ones who have appeared throughout history, who've kind of made an impact on developmental science and developmental psychology. So let's get started. We're going to start with somebody called Anna Freud. So Anna Freud is the daughter of Sigmund Freud, and she helped to develop psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud was very famous for doing psychoanalysis. His daughter sort of branched off from that. Sigmund Freud believed that development was very stage-oriented, that children entered one stage and then they went into another stage, and so on and so on. Anna Freud thought that development was continuous. So development sort of happened more gradual. It still happened in a sequence, but it wasn't so rigid. She also thought there was an interaction between biology and environment. So the genes that kids were born with impacted their environment, and the environment shaped child development as well. She came up with this term called defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are simply, sort of in Freudian speak, the ego, the way of coping with anxiety. And so when children are faced with traumatic situations or anything that would sort of induce stress or anxiety, they might go into one of these defense mechanisms. And there are lots more than I listed here, but just sort of the top three that she came up with are denial, regression, and displacement. Denial is sort of just like it sounds, denying that the bad thing is happening. So maybe if a child has a grandmother who died, they might pretend like she didn't die and that we're going to go to her house this Sunday. A regression might look like a child, let's say, who's already potty trained and is, a 6-year-old, might regress back into bedwetting or needing to wear diapers because of a stressful situation. Or they might displace their feelings onto somebody else. So if a child is frustrated because their parents are getting divorced, they might look at the dog and say, the dog is really unhappy. The dog is really angry today, because they're sort of displacing those feelings. So these are things that Anna Freud came up with. A lot of her work came from, a big study that she did came from an experiment in World War II where children were displaced in London and they had to go out into the countryside. And these kids might have been orphaned because their parents might have died in war, and so they didn't really have secure attachments to adults and not to their parents. So instead they were able to form secure attachments to peers. And this was a pretty new idea that Anna Freud came up with, because before people didn't think that children could make attachments to peers. They were kind of looking out for each other. And what this demonstrated was that kids who are experiencing extreme deprivation, the effects of this can sort of be counteracted by an enriched environment. So one aspect of that enriched environment was that children had peers to sort of rely on and form attachment bonds with and feel safe. So that's Anna Freud. Let's move on to Erik Erikson. So he sort of came also from this psychoanalytic perspective. Erik Erikson and his wife Joan Erikson both studied developmental science. The theory that he came up with is psychosocial development. So he really believed that social relationships and conscious choice were the strongest influencers to child development. He sort of extended Freud's stage theory that children go through different stages, and he kind of included adulthood into that too, so he extended it. These are the stages that Erik Erikson came up with. And they start in infancy and go all the way up through old age. And at each one of these stages, there is what Erikson calls sort of a life crisis. And at each life crisis, it could be what we think of as a minor life crisis, but to a child at that time, it seems quite major. So the first life crisis that a child goes through is trust versus mistrust. And it sounds exactly like what it is. This is when an infant is trying to figure out who in their environment they should build a trust bond with. Now, when they see a stranger at the grocery store waving at them saying, hi baby, that person is probably not a dangerous person. However, the infant needs to understand that that is not the person to build a trust relationship with. Not because they're a jerk, well, they might be, but I don't know, but because that's not the reliable person that's in their life. Their main caregivers are the ones to form the relationship with. I'll give one more example. Let's say in preschool, initiative versus guilt happens. So this is when kids might start to sort of try to do things, but might kind of mess it up or aren't quite able to have the skills to be able to carry out the stuff they want to do. Now, one famous life crisis, here's sort of a textbook definition of life crisis. You can pause it and read it if you'd like to write it down. Is an identity crisis. And this happens in adolescence where a person is examining their values and sort of making decisions about their role in life. So what do I stand for? What do I belong to? Excuse me, what does it all mean? And that's one of the more common ones in sort of the literature or in the pop culture. All right, so let's talk about Kenneth B. Clark. Kenneth B. Clark studied the development of self. And he specifically studied racial consciousness, so a sense of self in children that developed throughout early childhood. Now, he asked, one of his methodologies that he used for his studies to find out the development of self was asking children to look at line drawings, or later on he had them look at dolls, and had them ask them, which doll looks like you? And he helped to be able to discover when children were able to identify with a doll or a drawing that was of their own race. Now, this really uncovered a lot about identity and sense of self, that early development of sense of self. He later asked children to look at different dolls and see which one they preferred to play with. Now, I've just switched to a graph, or a table rather, that gives a lot of data from one of his early studies. So Kenneth Clark is another one who worked with his wife, who is also a researcher. She is also published on this study. Her name is Mamie Clark. And in this table, it outlines one of his most famous studies, which is the doll study. And it shows kind of what they did. So I'll tell you what they did in this study. Just don't worry too much about this table quite yet. But what they did in this study was they had children ages 3 years old to 7 years old. And they asked them 4 different questions. They asked them, which doll would you like to play with? Which doll do you think is nice? Which doll do you think looks bad? And which doll do you think has a nice color? And they also asked, which is not represented on this table, which doll do you think looks like you? And what this table shows is sort of the development of children's opinions of the doll and how it changes over time. And so this particular table that we're looking at is just black children, just African American children. And what we have in your table is sort of terminology that we don't use anymore these days. So they say colored doll and white doll. We don't say that. We would say black doll or white doll or African American doll or white doll. So just so you know, that's dated terminology from the year 1947. So I'll just highlight a couple of things from this graph that are sort of striking. We'll look at the percents. At age 3 years old, children deciding which doll they want to play with is relatively equal. However, when kids get into ages 4 and 5, they show a strong preference for playing with the white doll over the black doll. And this same preference sort of happens as children get older. So which doll do you think is nice? 36% say that the black doll is nice, 58% say that the white doll is nice, but it becomes much more striking as they get older. 24% of kids say that the black doll is nice, 76% say the white doll is nice by the time they're age 4. And the results are very similar across the other questions. So the takeaway from Kenneth B. Clark's study is that environmental racism is impacting children's identity and sense of self. And his work was very important in Brown versus the Board of Education when the United States decided to legalize school desegregation. And so that he was very important in the court proceedings that led that movement. All right, let's move on to Watson and Skinner. We're going to talk about behaviorism. So behaviorism is really sort of training behaviors, and this came out of animal research, and these folks wanted to later translate it to children. So what they came up with is something called operant conditioning. And operant conditioning uses something called reinforcement. Reinforcement is really just something that increases the frequency of behavior. So I'll give an example. If I see a child cleaning up toys, then I might say, here's a sticker. You've cleaned up toys, and I want you to keep cleaning up toys, so I'm going to reinforce that behavior. So the stimuli in this case is the sticker, and the behavior is the toy cleaning up. So the stimuli I give increases the behavior, which is cleanup. That's the reinforcer. Now, there's a couple of different kinds, and don't worry too much about getting confused about these. They're just textbook definitions that have to do with behaviorism. So there's a couple kinds of reinforcement. One is positive, and one is negative. And they don't have to do with good and bad. It's not that kind of positive and negative. It's just that positive reinforcers increase the frequency of behavior when they're applied, so like my sticker, whereas negative reinforcers increase the frequency of behavior when they're removed. So something that you take away to increase a behavior. This is all different than punishment. Punishment is different than reinforcement. Punishment is sort of something negative that happens to decrease the frequency of behavior. So reinforcement is always increasing frequency of behavior. Punishment is decreasing frequency of behavior. So that's how they're different. Watson and Skinner thought that punishment weren't so great because they didn't really give kids alternative behaviors, that you really needed to be there consistent and immediately offering the punishment every single time. And it might make children angry and hostile, which might sort of be counterproductive, is what they thought. They thought that punishment was counterproductive, whereas reinforcers are productive. And we still see this in school quite a bit. We see teachers using different types of reinforcers to get kids to do different types of behaviors. I know in the school where my niece attends, the kids all get check marks on the board every time they do something good. So they have a name, they write the kids' names on the board, and every time they do something good, they get a check mark. They get reinforced increase of behavior. And then if they get so many check marks by the end of the week, they get to pick out a toy at the end of the week. So they use behaviorists in that classroom. All right, let's look at one more, and then I will pause and switch to the next video. So let's look at Albert Bandura. Doesn't he look like a friendly guy? So Albert Bandura had this idea of social cognition. He was all about how we look at other people and model behavior from them. So he thought that learning occurs by observing other people, and those people are called models, more specifically role models. So he's the one that came up with that term, role models. Oops. So he strongly believed that children watch the adults or watch other people who are acting out behaviors, and they copy those behaviors. And he also had a very famous study, and I'll include the link to a video of that study in the module so you can see it, where he had a grown-up take a doll that was like a sort of a clown doll and just really be violent toward it, like beat it with a hammer, punch it in the face, and they had a kid watch. And so then they would take that kid, remove the adult, put that kid in the room where the clown doll was, they called him Bobo, and they watched to see what the kid did. And the kids that saw the adult beat up that toy doll went in the room and immediately started beating up the doll. Now the kids that didn't watch the adult beating up the doll just went in the room and started playing with the other toys. So he really showed that, hey, if you demonstrate violence to kids, kids are going to turn around and do violence too, which is interesting. I encourage you to watch the video because it's really interesting. All right, I'm going to pause here, and then you can go on to part 2, video part 2. We'll pick up the rest of our theorists after this.